Thanks so much for being on the show with me.
Thank you for having me.
Before I ask some of the questions about, vaginal gymnastics, which I'm really curious about, I guess I'd like to hear a little bit from you about why is this what you do? Like, how have you come to the place where this is your work?
Well, it's really interesting. It's a bit of a combination between me being a bit of a nerd and me having my own sort of issues when it came to sex in my previous relationship. It was one of those relationships where everything seems to be working except for sex. And I know you've spoken about this at length, which
Right.
I find fascinating. Sometimes, we were together in the middle of the pandemic, and it was a point where we just became roommates,
Yeah.
and I think that's a very common thing. And for us, sex was not working. Everything else was. So in my mind, it was like, if I could just fix this, it would all be perfect. And just being a bit of the very active, resolving person than I was. I just became obsessed with learning more about this stuff. And in my case specifically, I didn't have problems in terms of libido or orgasms. I've always been the higher libido partner in the relationship,
Okay.
which might be a little bit weirder. But in his sense, he had some trouble with sex in the past, which we're not often we don't often talk about how men can have their own traumas when it comes to sex,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is really
Yeah.
another topic in its own. We're kind of programmed to believe that men always want to have sex, constantly desire you. And I was like, because I had this idea in my mind, I'm like, well, this is clearly my issue, clearly my problem, right? Because he's supposed to be, ready all the time. So that whole mentality was definitely a problem. But again, he also had his own sort of things that he was dealing with. So in my efforts to try to help the situation, because again, the relationship was great otherwise, I started researching about, well, everything that I could really. And I was really getting at that point into fitness and body weight fitness. I've always really been into sports, but at that point I really needed to, basically because we're in the middle of the pandemic, in Buenos Aires, you could not go out at all. You couldn't go out for a walk, you couldn't go out for
Oh,
anything. You
wow.
could only
Okay.
go out in your same block if to your closest supermarket, and that was it.
Yeah.
So I was really developing my own program. I was being helped by fitness professionals on how to develop a program for myself in a tiny studio apartment.
Right.
With all of that in mind, I just started getting really interested in muscle biomechanics and how all of our muscles work and kinesiology and movement. And with that in mind, then I recalled some stories that I had heard when I was younger, when I was a precocious kid in everything but sex, because I was actually a very late bloomer when it came to that. But I remember really being fascinated by sex. I was raised in a very Catholic home. We didn't really talk about sex at all. But I was very much obsessed with the idea of it, just because of the taboo surrounding it in my specific context.
Right.
And so when I was a kid, I would read about these stories, and I would read about, I'm a bit of a history geek, and I would read about these women throughout history that allegedly were able to entrap this man, this powerful man, using the power of their vaginas. And I thought it was a little bit woo-woo. I thought it was a little bit weird. But then I started reading a little bit more about it. And then come the pandemic, I just remember recalling that and being like, is this actually a thing? Is this, now that I'm sexually active, is there some validity to this? And I started researching on this. And of course, I stumbled onto Kegels. We all know basic pelvic floor training. You inhale, as you exhale, you lift your pelvic floor. But the way that I was learning about the anatomy, I realized that our vagina is surrounded by muscles. So is it possible that not only do we have levels of depth, but we also can move the different sides in isolation? Can we move the front and the back and the left wall and the right wall? And do the same concepts apply, the same concepts of muscle biomechanics, do they apply to the vagina? So I bought a book on this that was a bit of a disappointment because it was very spiritual in nature, not really practical. And I'm a very secular, very pragmatic person. I just need the instructions. I'm a bit of I just need, like, I have an engineering mind. I just need you to tell me step by step, nothing else. Just tell me how to do this. And so I was like, okay, well, what else can I do? So as I started learning more about the pelvic floor muscles, I started applying what I knew about other muscles to the pelvic floor, and I started putting together my own program. And so I started training, started seeing if I could isolate, the right side and the left side of the vagina, the front side and the back, if I could combine these two planes of motion together to create new techniques. I would read about, women who were able in Thailand, who are able to like twist their muscles inside of them. So I'm like, okay, how would this even be possible? I found articles online in Chinese, in Thai. I asked that they would be translated, and I would find different, just pieces of content here and there, and just putting together the puzzle pieces of this. And then I started, training with my then partner, and he likes to say that he was the first product tester of our company.
Yeah.
Because we started having what I call research sex. So I started implementing this stuff in the bedroom, and things kind of took a 180-degree twist, just twist for us. It was very, very night and day thing, because when I introduced this new concept to the bedroom, it made everything, it's almost like it opened the doors for us to start talking about sex more openly. And we were enjoying each other a lot more, and my libido was off the charts and his libido was off the charts, and we were having just more and more sex. And while I was really happy about that, now I had the actual curiosity of like, well, what do you actually feel? Do you feel the right side and the left side? And I was just asking him questions about it. Oh, this feels a little bit more like this. Oh, this feels like you're almost like rubbing me up and down. Oh, this feels like rocking back and forth. And so we started putting together the exercises, and I would just program my own training. And when we were seeing our life, our sex life completely changed in that way. And he was the one who actually had the idea of like, look, you are, you're in your 20s, you haven't had any kids, your libido was healthy, but imagine what this would do to people who don't have that, women who maybe don't feel as much pleasure during sex, women who don't reach orgasm that often, because some of the things that we were seeing was like, the way I was reaching climax much faster. We were having sex much more frequently. We were both very aroused. Like things kept getting better and better, and some stuff started being a little bit weird. Like, the arousal loop was getting faster. Like we were getting triggered really easily. And I'm like, this has to be how is there no research on this? So then I started training women online, and then for an entire year, I just gathered data, and I started training more and more women who told other women, and then I just started putting together the program. And I realized I hired a friend of mine. I trained her in the program. We started training with more women, and so we realized that when we brought images to our Zoom discussions, and me pointing out where the different parts and the muscles were, because obviously these muscles are inside of us, so they're not as easy as training your bicep or your glutes that you can see it. So it's like, well, every time I brought some drawing or some visualization tools, they would get the exercises that much faster. So it's like, okay, this is interesting. So then that's when the idea of creating a visual program that was fully animated came about, and that's how the Olympus program came to be. And so we've been training women from all over the world, all different ages. We have a wonderful student who's 78, and she's in a nursery home just wrecking havoc. This woman is amazing. She's just doing all the exercises, twisting and wringing, and she's emailing me, and she's like, I want to know more, and what else can we do? We started getting letters from husbands and partners of students who were really happy that their love life and their intimate life had been changed because of this. It seemed that this sort of thing, not just because of the benefits that we know it has, like increased libido, increased pleasure, increased climax, it also seems to be maybe it's because it's the woman doing it first, but it seems to be a nice way to start the conversation around sex for the couple and change things in a way that both of them can start talking. And they were having more and more conversations, and they were rediscovering themselves sexually. That's a word that we always get in our emails. Like I feel like I'm rediscovering my husband.
Yeah.
And that was just really wonderful. And at the beginning of the year, I released a book on this methodology, this art, this practice of vaginal gymnastics. And I think right now we're number 5 in women's health. We're number 2 a couple of weeks ago. We're number 1 in women's health in Canada. Like it's just crazy, crazy, crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Just because really we're still discovering more and more benefits to this practice, and we're reaching more women, and that's just really wonderful.
So vaginal gymnastics is the training, basically the exercises, the training of all these
It's
distinct
just
muscles and movements and things like that.
absolutely. It's just this array of different exercises and skills that you can perform with with the muscles that surround the vagina, essentially.
And can any woman do this?
So theoretically, every person who has a female reproductive system and a vulva, you can do it. Doesn't we have women who have had kids, women who have had organ prolapse, incontinence. A lot of them come to us because of that. Postmenopause, premenopause, it doesn't really matter unless you have what is a caveat is if you happen to have your pelvic floor muscles already too tense and you have a hypertonic pelvic floor, which is very common, especially in type A people, we tend to be a little bit more stressed sometimes. A lot of us hold a lot of tension in our pelvic floors. We generally recommend, we sometimes have worked with doctors of patients, of students to see, okay, how can we help this woman relax properly so that then she can start training, because it's not really suggested that you start training if you have already a hypertonic pelvic floor. But then if that's not the case, there's absolutely for every woman out there.
Okay. So I guess I'm curious, how in the world do you describe, I'm sitting here thinking, can I feel the upper right-hand corner of my vagina? No, right? Like I've got a certain sense of
Correct.
feeling without a lot of nuance or just, distinctiveness in it. How do you just describe this in ways that people can do it? I hear what you're saying about adding the visual animation helps, but I'm really curious how you go from describing this over the internet to somebody being able to gain that kind of control.
I love it. And yes, the imagery plays a big part of it, because in the book is full of images. So I really make sure that that's part of it, because it is kind of hard to grasp because of these muscles being inside of us. But there's a lot of visual cues that every pelvic floor physician uses. So for example, just a really distinct cue is like, if you could imagine that you were trying to pick up a marble ball with your vaginal muscles, you see that there are two motions at play. You first sort of squeeze to grab it, and then you lift to pick it up. So these are two distinct exercises, for example, the gripping, the flexing of the muscles to sort of close the vagina, and then the lifting up. And that's a very simple cue that we use to sort of understand the difference between the squeezing movements, so the horizontal movements, and the lifting or contraction or Kegel movements, which are sort of the vertical movements. Then another cue that we use is we try to work with tempo. So this is another concept that is used very often in fitness, but really slowing down the concentric and the eccentric contraction. So slowly Kegeling all the way up and seeing how many levels of your vagina you can sort of sort of identify. And so generally we talk about 3 levels. We talk about the entrance, the first third, the second third, so in the middle where most women will find their G-spot, and sort of the higher third where it's generally near the cervix, right? And when we talk about these levels, then they start actively thinking about them when they're doing these exercises. So then when we combine these 2 planes of motion, let's say the squeezing and the contraction, we say, okay, when you squeeze, when you pick up that marble and you first grab it, where do you feel that most? Do you feel that most in the entrance? Do you feel that most in the middle? Do you feel that most at the top? And then we actively ask them to see if they can squeeze, differentiating between the 3 levels. Can you squeeze at the entrance? Can you squeeze in the middle? Can you squeeze closer to the top? It's probably going to be a little bit harder. And we tell them these cues. So for example, most of the exercises are going to feel much easier at the middle, where most of the muscle fibers are connected. So this is going to feel much more intuitive in the heart of the vagina. And it's going to be a lot harder, and even it's going to feel almost like there's more resistance at the top, and it's going to feel very subtle at the entrance. So with these cues in mind, people start identifying, they start actively training to get stronger at those different regions. And that's when we start combining different exercise and different skills.
Yeah, so it seems like the training is not just in the actual muscles, but in like feeling the muscles, right? Connecting to them and being able to differentiate them.
Absolutely. It's crazy. I recently started playing the trumpet, and something really interesting about that is the positioning of your, like the way that you play the trumpet is you not really do any notes with your mouth. What you really manage is how much air is going out through your mouth and the positioning of your lips and how much the opening essentially of your mouth is. And so then as you keep training it, you realize that, oh, for C, for this high C note, to hit that, I remember that this is the position of the lips. And you start doing it intuitively and you're like, this is really strange. At the beginning, I really had to think about this. Now it's almost like that position has been trained already and there's muscle memory. And the same is true for almost every single muscle. You know how you see, big guys that have really developed pectoral muscles and they can lift one pec and then the other and make them bounce. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. So in
So,
your
yeah.
experience with students and stuff, like I don't know, how long does it take somebody to get in touch with the various regions of their vagina and really be able to feel it and control it?
That's a great question. So I hate saying it depends, but it's going to depend on your starting point at the very least. So if you recently gave birth, it might take a little bit longer. If you have a weak pelvic floor, it might take a little bit longer. If you're, close to menopause, it might take a little bit longer. To this day, there hasn't been a woman that we haven't helped. So all of them have been able to train the exercise and succeed at this, which is great. But it might take a little bit longer depending on that. For most people, though, because our training comes into sort of 3 or 4 parts, the very beginning exercises are the ones where we build a foundation of strength in your pelvic floor. So the first things I want you to do are very basic Kegel type exercise. I want you to get familiar with the different vertical regions of your vagina. I want you to get familiar with tempo training, going slowly, eccentric contractions, full range of motion. All of these exercises, what they're going to do is they're going to build strength and awareness of the different vertical levels of the vagina. Generally, in 2 weeks, you've mastered these. It's rare that it will take a lot longer for women. What might take a little bit longer is stuff like resistance, because such as just like any other muscle, there are different fitness components to this. Power is one, endurance is another one, speed is another one, strength is another one, quality of contractions is another one. So for example, if we talk about endurance, what may take a little bit longer is to hold a contraction for a long time. So for example, for the first few weeks, you might be able to hold a contraction with a proper contraction quality or with proper form, as we say, for 20 seconds, but not longer than that. And maybe as you continue getting stronger, you might be able to hold it for 30 seconds and so forth. And more than that might be negligible results. But like at the beginning, it might take you a little bit longer to build that endurance. But in terms of dexterity, these beginner level exercises really don't take longer than 2 or 3 weeks. Then we get to the second stage, and that's when we start identifying the lateral walls. It's like, okay, can we squeeze? Can we start tilting someone or something, or our fingers back and forth? Can we whip, as in subsequently close the 3 levels of the vaginal canal in a wave-like motion? Can we really grip something really tight and not allow our partners to let go? All of these require a lot more dexterity, and the transition between a contraction and a squeeze is generally one of the hardest for people to understand. So, but it's also sort of the aha moment of Pompoir. So once you can clearly differentiate between lifting and squeezing, so lifting, narrowing shortening the vaginal canal, and squeezing, narrowing the vaginal canal, which is, one is closing and one is shortening, and one is, closing the lateral walls versus shortening the vertical levels, if you will. Once you understand that difference, everything becomes much easier, because all of the more complex skills are combinations of essentially those 2 motions throughout different walls of the vagina.
Okay.
So generally that transition between the contractions and the squeezes might take you anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. But once you understand that, then everything else is kind of unlocked for you. So let's say that it took you 2 weeks to start the initial training, and then 2 more weeks to understand the horizontal axis of movement. Then you have what we call the sagittal axis, so the front and back movements, moving the front wall and the back wall of the vagina. And that generally is actually quite more intuitive than the lateral walls are, because they're really distinct. Sometimes even in horizontal movements, some women will find that their left side is much stronger than the right side. And just like you have muscle imbalances in every part of your body, it's very common that you might have imbalances here, so you can work on that. But essentially, the front and the back walls tend to be much more intuitive, and we have a lot of cues for these as well. So let's say add another week for that. And then is when it really becomes fun, because then you can start developing sort of your own exercises and combining the 3 planes of motion to do, it's very different to rock back and forth at the entrance, at the middle, at the top. Or you can do a movement that's completely like spinning. You can, squeeze with your front, then your left, then your back, then your right, and do sort of like a spinning motion. there are many, many, many complex things that you can then start doing, like twisting and ringing. And that's when it becomes about optimizing for the moves that give you the most pleasure. What tends to happen is that people will start trying out the moves with their partners in the bedroom, and they will realize that they enjoy one move over the other, et cetera, et cetera. And they'll find their own sort of repertoire of moves that they enjoy the most. And they try them out in different positions, and they try them out at different moments during sex, because some moves can become almost too pleasurable. So it becomes almost a little bit too much stimulation. So you don't want to use them when you're just getting started if you're hoping for a longer session. So you want to maybe save them for a little bit later when you're really ready to climax. And then there are some moves that are better for the intro, for the beginning, for the middle, et cetera, et cetera.
It sounds a little bit too like, do you need a partner to be able to tell you that this is actually moving the way you think it is, right? Like how much, in terms of verifying this or confirming that I'm mastering this stuff, how helpful is it to have somebody with something inside that can say, yes, I feel the twist or the squeeze or whatever?
It's definitely helpful, but I found that the best tools that we have are our two fingers. So your fingers are your best friends when it comes to pompoir. And I know not everyone is comfortable with touching themselves, but ideally, if you can get through that hurdle, that is going to serve you really well when it comes to this practice, because your fingers are going to give you much more feedback, even than your partner, because sometimes all of this stuff is going to be very pleasurable nonetheless. So
right. And they may not be able to distinguish the various sensations, right? They just know, oh, that feels good. Yeah.
Students will be, the partners of our students will be like, oh, baby, this feels great. It's like, yeah, but just be more specific. I don't know. It feels okay. This feels great. It's like, well, this is, we do have some men in our, we have an open community in Reddit where we have just a bunch of people talk about their experiences. And there are a lot of partners of students who are like, oh, yeah, it actually feels kind of like you're rocking me back and forth. And then you're like shimming it feels good. Okay. So they try to be a little bit more descriptive, but the general, that's the minority. Most men will just be like, this just feels fantastic. I don't know what you're doing, woman, but this wizardry just feels great. So as ideally, your fingers are going to be much more objective at telling you the stuff that you're doing. However, there are some cues that we also give for these exercises. So for example, some exercises, especially when it comes to the sagittal plane, the back and forth muscles, when it's done at the middle of the vaginal canal, it becomes very, very pleasurable on its own. So a lot of women use pompoir when they're single just as a masturbation device. So even if you have your fingers inside of you or not, you can just start pressing your muscles against each other wherever you feel the most pleasure, which is generally rocking back and forth in the middle of the vagina and at the heart of the vagina, because that's where most women will find their G-spot. And some women will really enjoy really deep stimulation. So perhaps if they have a toy or a dildo or their fingers inside of them, they really want to target that A spot near the cervix. So they do like a sucking motion or pulsing motion, which are two exercises that are really, really deep near the cervical level. So to make the answer a little bit shorter, the fingers are going to be the best tool. Then there are obviously, some people have asked about devices. There are some devices, for example, the PeriFit is a phenomenal device that really is able to tell you if you're relaxing your muscles properly after each session, which is very, very important. It's going to give you some feedback on the exact stats of your strength, how well you're performing your strength, how much control you have over your contractions, but it's not going to give you feedback on the horizontal walls. It doesn't have a 360-degree sensory, electrical sensory of your muscles. So it's not going to give you very exact feedback, but it will give you really good feedback on your levels of strength and control and contraction quality. Now, again, your fingers are the best. Your partner might actually not be fantastic because they're just going to love it. Yeah. But then you have a lot of, when women start doing the practice, the more, it's almost like it feeds on itself. The stronger your pelvic floor muscles are, the more you're going to feel the sensations. So at the very beginning, it's going to feel really, that's why the first transition between contracting and squeezing might be a little bit harder, because you're going to feel it really subtly. But the stronger your muscles are and the tighter you are, quote unquote, the more you're going to have control over this exercise. Again, the stronger your pecs are, the more you're going to be able to make them bounce. So as you get stronger, each of the exercises will, on its own, without you having your fingers or your partners inside of you, you'll be able to tell what you're doing much more accurately.
Yeah. Would you say there are benefits to this that are not just about sexual pleasure?
Well,
Like what are the benefits for somebody doing this that are just separate from improving sex?
completely. So separate from improving sex, which is where most of the research we have is not on sex when it comes to pelvic floor training. It has to do with pelvic floor, urinary incontinence, organ prolapse, everything that has to do with the conditions that occur as we age, when we experience certain illnesses. Some patients with obesity, they have these problems. Some patients, as they grow older, we have these problems. A lot of things that sometimes we've taken as normal, but they shouldn't be. So, for example, leaking. A lot of people are like, well, my mom always leaked, and so I'm just going to leak. It's normal. There is not one study that says that leaking is normal. It might be frequent, and it might be common, but it's not normal. You're not supposed to. So all of these exercises, and not just pelvic floor training on its own, but also being able to properly relax your pelvic floor muscles. These are all going to really help with conditions that tend to occur as we grow older or as we have kids, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of overall health, this is actually a question that I asked a couple of weeks ago in our community. For those of you who are single, what are the reasons you use for training? No, and the biggest one is masturbation, is pleasure, because they really enjoy it on its own. But a lot of them are like, this is just part of my regular health. So just as I train my core muscles, my abs, my back, so that I can maintain my posture and my stability, the pelvic floor is a reactive set of muscles. So it also helps you stand up straight. It also helps you, when you're being chased, start running. It helps you balance yourself. It helps so much. It's essentially the floor of your core. So it works together with your abdominals, with your back muscles, with your diaphragm. So everything is a well-oiled machine, ready for you to run when you need to run, sit when you need to sit, balance yourself in one leg when you need to balance, and stretch yourself out when you need that. So it should be part of an integral workout program for your body.
I think you're making a strong case. So will you tell people where do they find, like, your book, your program, like where do they go to learn more, to work with you?
Absolutely. So if you go to goddess.com, that's GOHDDESS, so goddess.com, because O is the word that we have the most from our students. So goddess.com, you will find access to everything, not just the program, the Olympus program, but also the book, but also our coaching sessions, and also a lot of free content as well. I have a lot of articles on this. I have a lot of YouTube videos on this. My biggest goal is for this to become a practice that everyone does, regardless of whether they have a partner, regardless of whether they want to improve their libido, their pleasure, their climax, or if they want to give that to their partners as well, or if they just want this to be part of their health. I want everyone to learn about this. So you have a bunch of free resources, and you have access to all of the stuff that we have to offer. And as we find out about more exercises, we keep creating and adding more lessons and more articles and more about everything, because we're just in this, we're in this journey now, and we really, really like it.
Right. I'll put that link in the show notes too, so people have direct access. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. No, thank you. This is such a great platform that you have, and I think we need this. We need this more than ever now. Yeah.
Thanks.